July 24th, 1943, 11:45 at night. A Himmelbett ground controller sits behind a Seeberg plotting table inside a concrete bunker on the North German coast. His name does not survive in the Allied transcripts that recorded what he said next. What survives is his voice on a radio frequency that British listening stations were monitoring from across the North Sea. For the past 20 minutes, his two giant Wurzburg radars have been doing exactly what they were built to do. One dish, the one the Germans called the Red Giant, is tracking a stream of British bombers inbound toward Hamburg at roughly 20,000 feet. The other dish, the Green Giant, is tracking a German night fighter climbing to intercept. On the plotting table in front of the controller, 2 points of light are converging, the bomber and the fighter. The geometry is clean, the intercept is 15 seconds from contact, and then something happens that the controller has never seen in 3 years of directing night fighters over the Reich. His scope fills with light. Where there had been one bomber, there are now 100, then 500, then what looks like 1,000 aircraft, all appearing simultaneously, all moving at impossible angles, some of them hanging motionless in the sky, some drifting slowly eastward like a cloud of luminous dust. The Red Giant is no longer tracking a bomber, it is tracking everything, and therefore nothing. The fighter he had been guiding is now lost somewhere inside a blizzard of false returns that has swallowed the entire radar picture from the coast to the city. The controller keys his radio. The words the British monitoring station records him saying will later be reproduced by historian Alfred Price, and they are the words of a man watching the most precise air defense system on Earth die in real time. He says, in German, that the enemy are reproducing themselves. He says, it is impossible. He says there are too many hostiles. Seconds later, another controller on the same network transmits that he cannot control his fighter. A third says something that, in a military system built on the absolute faith that radar would always find the target, amounts to an admission of total defeat. He tells his pilot to try without ground control. Try without the system. Try on your own. The system is gone. Within 20 minutes, every radar-guided anti-aircraft battery ringing Hamburg, every searchlight director, every fighter control station in the Himmelbett belt covering the northern approach to the city is reporting the same thing. The screens are useless. 240 heavy flak guns are still firing, but they are firing blind, throwing shells into the darkness without guidance, without prediction, without the precision that had made German anti-aircraft defense the most feared in the world. By morning, the British will count their losses. Of roughly 791 bombers dispatched to Hamburg that night, 12 have been lost. 12. The expected loss rate had been 6%, roughly 47 aircraft. The actual rate was 1.5%. Something had cut the kill rate of German air defense by 3/4 in a single night. What the controller was watching on his dying radar screen, and what 240 gun crews were experiencing as the sudden disappearance of their ability to aim, was the first operational use of a weapon that weighed almost nothing, cost almost nothing, and had been held back for over a year because the men who built it were afraid it worked too well. That weapon was strips of paper backed with aluminum foil, cut to a length of 27 centimeters, dropped in bundles from the bomb bays of aircraft flying ahead of the main force. The British called it window. The Americans called it chaff. The Germans, who had independently invented it and then been forbidden by their own leadership from studying it further, called it Doppel. And the story of how strips of paper blinded the most sophisticated radar network on the planet, and how the bombers that followed learned to see through the very clouds that hid them from the gunners below, is not a story about technology alone. It is a story about two systems, one that trusted its scientists and one that silenced them, one that shared its secrets across laboratories and one that buried its secrets in competing bureaucracies. The German radar operators who lost their war in the dark over Hamburg were not beaten by a better machine. They were beaten by a better way of building machines. And they were beaten, in the cruelest twist of the entire air war, by a weapon their own scientists had already built and their own commander had ordered them to forget. To understand what went blind over Hamburg, you have to understand what had been built. And to understand what had been built, you have to go back to a laboratory in Berlin in the middle of the 1930s, where a company called Telefunken was building something no other country on Earth yet had in operational form. The Germans did not invent radar. The British did, or more precisely, A Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt demonstrated in February of 1935 that radio waves bouncing off aircraft could be detected at distance. The British built the chain-home network, the string of tall masts along the English coast that helped win the Battle of Britain in 1940. But the Germans took radar in a different direction. Where the British built long-range early warning, the Germans built precision. The Wurzburg radar, designated FUMG-62, went into service with the Luftwaffe in 1940. It operated at a frequency of roughly 560 MHz, which gave it a wavelength of about 53 centimeters. It used a parabolic dish, 3 meters across, and could track an aircraft at ranges up to 29 kilometers, with a range accuracy of roughly 25 meters. That was good enough to put a shell within lethal distance of a bomber, but the real achievement was the larger version, the Wurzburg Ries, the giant Wurzburg, designated FUMG-65. It used a dish 7.4 meters across. It could track a bomber at 70 kilometers. Its angular accuracy was between 0.1 and 0.2 degrees, which meant it could hold a target to within a few dozen meters at engagement range. Over 4,000 Wurzburg radars of all types were produced during the war. Roughly 1,500 of the giant version were built. Together, they formed the backbone of the most accurate radar-guided anti-aircraft system any nation had yet deployed. But a radar dish alone does not shoot down a bomber. The Wurzburg fed its data to a device called the Commando Gerät 40, an analog fire control computer the size of a large desk, crammed with gears and cams and mechanical integrators. The Commando Gerät took continuous range, bearing, and elevation data from the radar, computed where the target would be by the time the shell reached altitude, and transmitted firing solutions to up to 16 guns simultaneously. In daylight, the doctrine was to use the radar to slew an optical director onto the target, and then complete the engagement visually. At night or in cloud, the radar alone guided the guns. The system was devastatingly effective. A wartime American radar intelligence assessment noted that German flak was most deadly when it could combine Wurzburg range data with optical angular data. A captured Wurzburg tested by the Allies showed 80% of its readings fell within 0.2 degrees and 60% within 0.1 degrees. Allied bomber crews developed what the same report called a healthy respect for the system, because it punched substantial holes in their formations, whether the sky was clear or overcast, whether it was day or night. The air defense network that this radar fed into was itself a masterpiece of engineering. Beginning in July of 1940, General Joseph Kamhuber built a belt of interlocking radar-controlled interception zones, stretching from Denmark through the Low Countries and into northern France. The British called it the Kamhuber Line. The official German name for each zone was Himmelbett, which translates roughly as four-poster bed. Each zone contained a Freya early warning radar with a range of over 100 kilometers, a master searchlight, and 2 giant Wurzburg dishes. One dish, the red giant, tracked the incoming bomber. The other, the green giant, tracked the assigned night fighter. A controller at a Seeberg plotting table watched both tracks converge and guided the fighter to within visual or airborne radar range of the target. At its peak, the Kamhuber line contained roughly 750 of these Himmelbett zones, arranged in a vast defensive curve across Western Europe. Over the defended cities themselves, the flak was concentrated in staggering density. Hamburg had 240 heavy guns within an 11-mile radius. Kassel had 110 within 4 miles. A bomber approaching a major target might be tracked simultaneously by half a dozen Wurzburg radars, with up to 20 brought to bear over the target itself. The famous 88mm gun, the flak 18, 36, and 37 series, could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute to an effective ceiling of roughly 26,000 feet. The larger 105mm gun reached over 31,000 feet. The 128mm, the heaviest standard anti-aircraft gun in the German arsenal, reached 35,000 feet and fired roughly 10 rounds per minute. A shell had to burst within about 30 to 80 feet of a bomber to destroy it. With radar-predicted fire, the Germans were putting shells inside that lethal radius with mechanical regularity. By the middle of 1943, this system had consumed resources on a scale that tells you how seriously the Germans took the air war. According to historian Edward Westermann, the core strength of the German flak arm was 528,000 men in 1940, rising to 573,000 by November of 1944. When you added the auxiliaries, the Hitler Youth flak helpers, the labor service conscripts, the women, and the prisoners of war who were pressed into service, the total personnel devoted to ground-based air defense exceeded 1 million. The flak arm absorbed 1/3 of the entire output of the German optical industry, and between 1/2 and 2/3 of all radar and signals equipment production. By February of 1944, Germany had deployed roughly 13,500 heavy flak guns, 21,000 light flak guns, 7,000 searchlights, and 2,400 barrage balloons. This was not a sideshow. This was one of the largest single military enterprises in German history, and it was built on one assumption. The assumption was that the radar would always see the target. The Americans learned what that assumption meant in the autumn of 1943. The 8th Air Force had been building toward the doctrine of precision daylight bombing, the idea that heavily armed B-17 formations flying in tight defensive boxes at high altitude could fight their way to a target, bomb it accurately through the Norden bomb site, and fight their way home without fighter escort. The theory was tested on August 17, 1943, when 376 B-17s were dispatched on a split mission to the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The force heading for Schweinfurt was savaged. German fighters hit the formations for hours. Over Schweinfurt itself, the flak was radar-directed and precise. 60 bombers were lost, roughly 16% of the force. 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The 8th Air Force went back to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. The date became known as Black Thursday. 291 B-17s were dispatched, 60 were shot down, 17 more were damaged beyond repair. Roughly 26% of the attacking force was destroyed or written off. Approximately 650 airmen were casualties. The official Army Air Force's history acknowledged that the 8th Air Force had temporarily lost air superiority over Germany. Deep penetration raids without fighter escort were suspended. October of 1943 was the worst month the 8th would experience in the entire war, with a B-17 loss rate of roughly 7.6% per mission. At that rate, a bomber crew's statistical chance of completing a 25-mission tour was essentially zero. German intelligence assessed the results and reached a conclusion that mirrored the assessment their ground forces had made about American infantry a year earlier in North Africa. The Americans had machines. They had numbers, but they could not sustain the punishment. The radar-guided flak and the fighter defenses were winning. The bomber offensive, the Germans believed, was a problem that was solving itself. They were wrong. And the reason they were wrong had already been built, tested, and was sitting in a warehouse at the Telecommunications research establishment in Malvern, England, waiting for permission to be used. The weapon that would break the back of German radar-guided air defense had been ready since early 1942. It had been invented by a physicist who never flew a combat mission and who never fired a gun. Her name was Joan Curran. Joan Curran was a Welsh-born physicist working at the Telecommunications research establishment, the secret British radar laboratory known as TRE. In early 1942, she was asked to solve a problem that the head of British scientific intelligence, a young physicist named Reginald Victor Jones, had identified as early as 1937. The problem was simple in theory. A strip of metal cut to half the wavelength of a radar transmission would resonate at that frequency and produce a false echo indistinguishable from an aircraft. If you dropped enough strips, you could fill a radar screen with so many false targets that the real ones would disappear into the noise. Jones had proposed the idea before the war. Curran made it work. She developed strips of black paper backed with aluminum foil, cut to roughly 27 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, matching the half wavelength of the Wurzburg radar. Bundled together and dropped from an aircraft, they would bloom into a cloud of thousands of false returns, each one looking to the radar operator exactly like a bomber. The codename was Window. Window worked. Everyone who tested it knew it worked, and for over a year the British refused to use it. The reason was fear. Not fear that it would fail, but fear that it would succeed too well. If the British revealed the principle of radar blinding foil, the Germans would immediately copy it and use it against the chain-home radar network that protected Britain from air attack. The argument consumed the highest levels of the British War Cabinet. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, wanted to use it immediately. His crews were dying at rates that could not be sustained. Fighter Command resisted. The Admiralty resisted. Watson Watt himself, the man who had built British radar, opposed releasing Window because he feared for his own creation. Jones argued that the fear was irrational. The Germans, he pointed out, had almost certainly already thought of the same idea. In fact, they had. German scientists had independently developed their own version, which they called Dupel, after the Berlin estate where the tests were conducted. And here is where the story takes the turn that, for the German radar operators who would later sit in darkness wondering why their screens had died, was the cruelest detail of the entire war. When the German Doppel tests proved successful in 1942, the results were reported to the Luftwaffe High Command. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring read the report and panicked. Not because the British might use chaff against Germany, because the Germans might accidentally reveal the idea, and the British would then use it against Germany. Göring ordered the Doppel tests stopped. He ordered the reports classified and suppressed. He forbade further research into both the weapon and countermeasures against it. At the precise moment when German radar engineers should have been racing to develop filters and modifications that could distinguish real targets from foil strips, their own commander-in-chief had ordered them to pretend the problem did not exist. In the summer of 1943, Winston Churchill convened a Chiefs of Staff meeting to settle the Window debate. Jones presented his case. Watson Watt remained opposed. But Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory of Fighter Command had been persuaded that the reduction in Bomber Command losses outweighed the risk to British defences. Churchill made the decision. The words attributed to him have become one of the quietly famous lines of the Secret War. He said, "Very well, let us open the window." Arthur Harris chose the target. It would be Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city and one of the most heavily defended targets in the Reich. The operation was called Gomorrah. On the night of July 24, 1943, 791 bombers flew toward Hamburg. Ahead of the main force, designated aircraft began dropping Window, by some estimates as many as 92 million strips of foil tumbling into the darkness above the North Sea. The effect was immediate, total, and to the men operating the German radars, incomprehensible. The Himmelbett controllers lost their targets within minutes. Night fighters that had been vectored towards specific bombers were suddenly surrounded by hundreds of phantom contacts moving in every direction. Pilots reported firing at empty sky. One night fighter pilot later recalled that he found himself surrounded by slow-moving false contacts, fired in every direction, and landed to report that everyone was helpless and bewildered. The flak batteries over Hamburg, their Wurzburg radars drowning in false returns, switched from predicted fire to barrage fire, throwing shells at altitudes and grid squares rather than at tracked aircraft. The searchlights, which depended on Wurzburg data to lock onto targets, swung randomly across the sky without finding anything to hold. General Kamhuber, the man who had spent 3 years building the defensive belt that bore his name, is reported to have summarized the night in a single assessment. He said the whole defense was blinded in one stroke. The gunners, who had been killing bombers with mechanical precision 48 hours earlier, were now firing blindly into a sky full of ghosts, and the bombers were coming through almost untouched. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of the scientists, the crews, and the invisible war they fought visible a little longer, and that matters more than I can say. The Germans, to their credit, had already been preparing an alternative even before the blindness fell. A Luftwaffe officer named Major Hajo Hermann had proposed a solution weeks earlier that was radical, precisely because it abandoned the system the Germans had spent 3 years building. Hermann's idea was called Wild Sow, Wild Boar. Instead of radar-directed interceptions through the Himmelbett system, single-engine day fighters, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, would fly above the burning cities without radar guidance, spot the bombers silhouetted against the fires and the searchlight beams below, and attack visually. Hermann's unit, Jägerschwader 300, first tested Wild Boar over Cologne on the night of July 3rd and 4th, 1943, 3 weeks before Hamburg. They claimed 12 of the 30 bombers lost that night. By early August, Hermann had received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross for his night-fighting leadership. Weeks later, over Berlin on August 23rd and 24th, Wild Boar pilots claimed 57 aircraft in a single night, the tactic's most dramatic success. But it was Hamburg that turned Wild Boar from a promising experiment into the primary night defense. With the Himmelbett radars blinded by window, there was no longer an alternative. Wild Boar was all that was left. But Wild Boar was a temporary solution to a permanent problem. The pilots were flying at night in single-engine fighters without radar, often through their own flak, often in weather that would kill them before the enemy did. Accident rates were catastrophic. Aircraft wore out. The best pilots were used up. By spring of 1944, Wild Boar had largely faded as a viable tactic. Its companion approach, Zamsau, tame boar, was more sustainable. Tame boar controllers used the chaff cloud itself as a tracking tool, feeding twin-engine night fighters into the bomber stream and letting them hunt with their own airborne radar once inside. It worked better than Wild Boar, but it conceded the fundamental point. The ground-based radar control system that Kammhuber had spent 3 years perfecting was gone. Every German adaptation after July of 1943 was an attempt to fight the air war without the system that had been designed to win it. And while the Germans were improvising replacements for a blinded network, the Allies were building the next generation of weapons to blind whatever the Germans built to replace it. But window, as devastating as it was on that first night, was only the beginning. It was the first move in an electronic arms race that would transform the air war over Europe from a contest of metal against metal into a contest of frequencies against frequencies, of physicists against physicists, of entire scientific establishments against each other. And in that contest, the side that won was not the side with better scientists. The Germans had superb scientists. The side that won was the side that let its scientists talk to each other. To understand why, you need to know about a raid that happened 17 months before Hamburg, a raid that most histories of the air war mention in a paragraph and move past, but that was, in terms of what it made possible, one of the most consequential small operations of the entire conflict. On the night of February 27th, 1942, a force of British paratroopers from C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion dropped onto the coast of France near a small village called Bruneval. Their objective was a single piece of equipment sitting inside a German radar station on the clifftop, a Wurzburg radar. British scientific intelligence, guided by Jones, had identified the Wurzburg from aerial photographs taken by a Spitfire reconnaissance pilot and needed to know its exact operating parameters, its frequency, its pulse characteristics, its vulnerabilities. The only way to get that information was to steal the machine. The paratroopers landed in snow under a bright moon. The operation was commanded by Major John Frost, who would later become famous for holding the bridge at Arnhem. The men split into 3 groups. One group assaulted the radar station itself. A second secured the beach for evacuation. A third provided cover. The initial assault overwhelmed the garrison quickly, but the critical task belonged to one man. Flight Sergeant Charles Cox was a radar mechanic from the Royal Air Force who had been recruited for the mission because he understood what he was looking at. Cox had never parachuted before being selected for Operation Biting. He had never been under fire. He was a technician, not a commando, but he was the only man in the raiding party who could identify the components that mattered. While German reinforcements from a nearby garrison began closing in from both directions along the coastal road, Cox worked on the Wurzburg by flashlight, photographing the display unit, removing the transmitter and receiver components, carefully extracting the crucial pulse modulation unit that would reveal the radar's operating characteristics. Bullets were hitting the clifftop around him. Frost was urging speed. Cox kept working. When he had pulled everything the scientists needed, the raiders fought their way down to the beach, loaded the equipment and a captured German radar operator onto landing craft, and withdrew across the channel under fire. The Wurzburg components were delivered to TRE within hours. The intelligence value was enormous. The scientists now had the operating frequency, the pulse width, the receiver sensitivity, the antenna gain characteristics, everything they needed to design a jammer that would kill the Wurzburg at the source. One flight sergeant with a screwdriver and a flashlight on a freezing French clifftop had handed the Allied scientific establishment the key to the German air defense system. The German command recognized the significance of the loss and began modifying their coastal radar installations. But the damage was done. The secret was out. The man who turned that intelligence into a weapon was not British. He was an American radio engineer named Frederick Terman. Before the war, Terman had been a professor at Stanford University, best known for encouraging two of his students, William Hewlett and David Packard, to start a small electronics company in a garage in Palo Alto. When the war began, Terman was recruited to lead the Radio Research Laboratory at Harvard University, a secret facility whose sole purpose was to build devices that would jam, deceive, and blind German radar. His staff eventually grew past 850 people. Using the Wurzburg data from the Bruneval raid, Terman's laboratory designed a noise jammer that broadcast static on the Wurzburg's operating frequency, overwhelming the real signal with electronic noise. The Americans called it carpet. Carpet was not elegant. It was a brute-force barrage jammer that simply drowned the Wurzburg's receiver in noise, but it worked. The 8th Air Force began installing carpet transmitters in its bombers in the autumn of 1943, and by 1944, most heavy bombers carried 2 carpet sets. A wartime American analysis compared one bomb group's losses before and after the introduction of jamming. With chaff and basic carpet barrage jamming, the group's loss rate to flak was 2.55%, and its major damage rate was 5.5%. When the more advanced spot jamming version was added, the loss rate dropped to 0.4%, and the major damage rate fell to 0.8%. The analysts cautioned that these figures came from rapidly changing conditions and should not be treated as precise measurements, but the direction was unmistakable. The Wurzburg was dying. Carpet was only one piece of the electronic umbrella. The companion system, called Mandrel, jammed the Freya early warning radars, which operated at lower frequencies between 95 and 210 MHz. Tinsel and Airborne Cigar jammed the voice communications between German ground controllers and their night fighter pilots. Jostle, a high-power communications jammer operated by the Royal Air Force's No. 100 Group, blanketed entire sectors. Moonshine spoofed German radar by receiving Freya pulses and retransmitting them amplified, making a single aircraft look like an entire formation. The British created No. 100 Group specifically to coordinate all of it, an entire bomber support group whose sole job was not to drop bombs but to blind, deafen, and confuse the enemy's electronic senses. I want you to hold that image for a moment. One side of this war had built an enormous radar and gun network employing over 1 million people and consuming 1/3 of the national optical industry. The other side had built a laboratory full of radio engineers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who were designing boxes of vacuum tubes that made the entire network useless. The asymmetry of that exchange, the sheer disproportion between the investment in the weapon and the investment in the counterweapon, is one of the defining features of the electronic war, and it was only half of the problem the German gunners were about to face. Because while Terman's laboratory was blinding the radars that guided the guns, another laboratory 4 miles away was solving the mirror problem, the problem that had been crippling the American bombing campaign since the day it began. The problem was the weather. Western Europe is one of the cloudiest regions on Earth. Storms cross the continent roughly every 3 days. The 8th Air Force, which was committed to visual precision bombing through the Norden bomb site, could only operate when the sky over the target was clear enough for a bombardier to see the ground from 25,000 feet. In December of 1942, not a single day met that criterion. The first 15 days of January 1943 produced no operational days either. 8th Air Force meteorologists estimated that visual bombing of targets in Germany was possible only about 20 to 30% of the time. For the other 70 to 80%, the most powerful bomber force in history sat on the ground in England, while German factories ran without interruption. The solution came from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory, the secret facility known as the RAD Lab, which had become the largest single scientific project in the United States apart from the Manhattan Project. At its peak, the RAD Lab employed roughly 4,000 people in a sprawling complex on the MIT campus. Its director was Lee Dubridge, a physicist who would later become president of the California Institute of Technology. Its staff included some of the most brilliant minds in American physics, among them Luis Alvarez, a young physicist from the University of California who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1968. Alvarez developed ground-controlled approach radar, which allowed blinded aircraft to land in zero visibility conditions, and worked on the Eagle precision bombing radar before being pulled away to join the Manhattan Project. The Rad Lab was not a single laboratory. It was an ecosystem, a place where physicists, engineers, and military officers worked side by side on problems that ranged from submarine detection to blind bombing radar to airborne early warning. And one of its most consequential products was the device that would turn the American bombing campaign from a fair-weather enterprise into an all-weather one. A physicist named George Valley led the development of a device that would allow a bomber to see the ground through 10/10 cloud cover. The device was called H2X, a 3-centimeter X-band airborne ground mapping radar derived from the British H2S system. It replaced the ball turret on the underside of a B-17 with a retractable radome and projected a rough image of the terrain below onto a screen in front of a specially trained radar operator. Cities, rivers, and coastlines showed up as distinct shapes. It was not precise enough to hit a single factory, but it was precise enough to hit a city, and it could do it through solid overcast that no human eye could penetrate. The crews called it Mickey. The name was coined by Major Fred Rabot of the 482nd Bomb Group, the Pathfinder unit that would carry the first H2X sets into combat. The official designation was bombing-through-overcast, but nobody used it. They called it Mickey, and Mickey changed the war. The first H2X-equipped B-17s reached England in early October of 1943. They were first used in combat on November 3, 1943, when the 8th Air Force struck the U-boat port of Wilhelmshaven through solid cloud cover. 539 of 566 heavy bombers dispatched hit the target area. 7 were lost, a rate of roughly 1.2%. It was the 8th Air Force's first 500 bomber raid, and its first successful strike through total overcast. After the bloodbath of October, when 1 in 13 bombers had not come back, Wilhelmshaven felt like a reprieve. By December of 1943, H2X-equipped Pathfinder aircraft were leading 90% of 8th Air Force missions. The original dozen sets had multiplied. Formations now dropped their bombs on the Pathfinder leader's signal, and the Pathfinder could see the target when no one else in the formation could see anything but cloud. The 8th dropped more bombs in December of 1943 than in any previous month, and exceeded Royal Air Force Bomber Command's tonnage for the first time. In March of 1944, H2X led the 8th to Berlin through overcast on the 6th, the 8th, the 9th, and the 22nd of the month. The accuracy was poor. A winter 1944-45 assessment found that 42% of bombs dropped by non-visual methods fell more than 5 miles from the target. But accuracy, in the larger strategic calculus, was secondary to persistence. The bombers were now hitting Germany every day the crews could fly, not every day the sky was clear. The pressure never stopped. The German war economy could no longer count on cloud cover as a shield. And here is the inversion that the German anti-aircraft crews experienced as a slow catastrophe they could feel, but never fully articulate. Before 1943, the equation had been simple. Clear skies favoured the gunners. The Wurzburg could track, the commando could predict, the optical directors could confirm, and the shells went where they were aimed. Cloud cover favoured the bombers, but only passively, because the bombers could not bomb what they could not see. So cloudy days were simply days when nothing happened. After the autumn of 1943, the equation reversed. The bombers could now see through the clouds with H2X. The gunners could not see through the chaff and the jamming. The hunters had become the blind, and the hunted had become the ones who could see. On an overcast day in 1944, a formation of American heavy bombers was operating in a world the German gun crews could not enter. The bombers had radar eyes pointed downward through the clouds. The guns had radar eyes pointed upward into a blizzard of aluminum foil and electronic noise. The bombers could find the target. The guns could not find the bombers. The German gunners were reduced to what they called predicted barrage fire, calculating the most likely altitude and course of the bomber stream based on sound locators, fragmentary visual sightings through gaps in the cloud, and educated guesswork, then firing thousands of shells into a box of sky and hoping something hit. The 88mm guns were burning through ammunition at rates that would have been unthinkable in 1941, according to figures cited by Westermann and other historians. The estimated number of 88mm rounds required to bring down a single heavy bomber rose from roughly 4,000 in the early years of the war to approximately 16,000 by 1944. Historian Donald Nijboer has cautioned that this figure is widely misunderstood and should not be taken as a precise measurement, noting that the more modern 128mm gun required only about 3,000 rounds per kill in the same period. But the direction was undeniable. The flak, that had been a precision instrument in 1941, had become a blunt one by 1944. The trajectory is visible in the mission records. In October of 1943, when the 8th Air Force was losing 7 to 8% of its bombers per mission, the electronic countermeasure campaign was barely underway. Chaff had not yet been adopted by the Americans for daylight use. Carpet jammers were just beginning to arrive. H-2X had not yet flown its first mission. The bombers were naked in clear skies, visible to every Wurzburg dish on the continent. 6 months later, in March and April of 1944, the same bombers were flying under an electronic umbrella that included chaff dispensers, multiple carpet jammers per aircraft, mandrel screens jamming the Freya early warning radars, Pathfinder aircraft with H-2X leading formations through solid overcast, and P-51 escorts sweeping the fighters away. The loss rate per mission had dropped to roughly 3%, and on many individual missions it was below 2%. The bombers that had been dying at an unsustainable rate in the autumn were now coming back. Not all of them, not safely, but in numbers the 8th Air Force could sustain, month after month, while the force kept growing larger. For the German gun crews on the ground, the experience was the inverse. They were still firing. They were still dangerous. A heavy flak shell did not need radar to kill if it burst close enough. But they were increasingly firing without knowledge, without the feedback loop that told them whether their shells were coming close. In the early years, the Commandergerät had given them continuous tracking. They could watch each salvo bracket the target and adjust. Now they were firing into clouds and hearing nothing back. The explosions were happening somewhere above the overcast, in a sky they could not see, at aircraft they could not track. Albert Speer later recalled that after Hamburg, he warned the Air Ministry that if the Allies could repeat that kind of result on 4 or 5 other German towns, war production would collapse. The warning was heard. It was not acted upon quickly enough. The natural question is why the Germans did not adapt. They were not fools. Their scientists were among the best in Europe. They had built the Wurzburg in the first place, a radar superior in precision to anything the Allies had at the time. They knew, from their own duple tests, that chaff was coming. Why did they not prepare? The answer is the part of this story that has less to do with physics and more to do with power, and it begins with a single man's contempt for the people who were trying to save him. Hermann Göring was the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and the man personally responsible for the air defense of the Reich. Göring had been a fighter ace in the First World War and considered himself an expert on air combat. He was not an expert on radar. He did not understand it. He did not trust the men who did understand it, and he made this known in ways that crippled the German electronic warfare effort at the moment it needed support the most. The Luftwaffe's signals chief, General Wolfgang Martini, had been promoting radar development since 1938 and had overseen the deployment of the Wurzburg network. Martini understood the threat of Allied jamming and pressed repeatedly for resources to develop countermeasures. Göring dismissed him. In remarks that other German commanders later recalled, Göring is reported to have said that Martini was a fool who, like all specialists, exaggerated the importance of whatever he was working on. This was not merely personal dislike, it was institutional paralysis. When German scientists tested Doppel in 1942 and proved that strips of foil could blind the Wurzburg, the correct response was to immediately begin developing radar modifications that could distinguish real targets from foil. Filter out the stationary returns. Look for the Doppler shift of a moving aircraft. Redesign the receiver. The Germans had the engineering talent to do all of this. Göring's order to suppress the Doppel findings and halt countermeasure research froze that effort for over a year. When window finally fell over Hamburg on July 24, 1943, the German radar network had no prepared countermeasure. The gun crews were helpless not because the problem was unsolvable, but because the man at the top had forbidden anyone from working on the solution. After Hamburg, the Germans scrambled. Telefunken and other firms rushed out a series of modifications to the Wurzburg, collectively nicknamed the Lauers family, the word meaning Lauers. The most important was Wurzlaus, a system that injected a continuous wave signal into the Wurzburg transmitter and used the resulting phase changes to detect the Doppler shift of a moving target against the stationary chaff background. It partially worked, but it was difficult to tune. It degraded the radar's range and tracking precision, and it was never fitted to more than a fraction of the thousands of Wurzburg sets deployed across the Reich. Another modification, called Nürnberg, used audio demodulation to let operators hear the propeller modulation of a genuine aircraft, a distinctive buzzing signature that chaff strips did not produce. It was planned for all radar sets by the end of 1944, but fewer than half were actually equipped. Later modifications, the Tasslaus, the K-Laus, the experimental Fakir and Frigga systems, arrived too late in too few numbers to change the outcome. The deeper problem was structural. The Allied electronic warfare effort was built on a model of open, centralized, well-funded scientific collaboration. The MIT Radiation Laboratory had roughly 4,000 staff working under a single organizational umbrella with direct access to operational commanders. The Harvard Radio Research Laboratory had 850 people focused entirely on countermeasures. The British Telecommunications research establishment at Malvern fed its developments directly into operational units through a streamlined chain that put a new jammer in a bomber within months of its conception. Jones's scientific intelligence operation closed the loop, capturing enemy equipment, analyzing it, and feeding the results back to the laboratories. Churchill personally backed the effort. He called it the Wizard War. He meant it. The German system was the opposite. Radar development was split between the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, competing private firms, and agencies that guarded their work from each other as jealously as they guarded it from the enemy. Göring's contempt for technical specialists meant that radar engineers could not get the resources or the priority they needed. When Albert Speer, the armaments minister, tried to rationalize war production, the Luftwaffe resisted his authority over its own procurement. The result was duplication, delay, and a chronic inability to move a laboratory prototype into mass production at the speed the war demanded. Telefunken was developing a microwave frequency radar called Berlin that operated at 9.2 centimeters and could have partially countered Allied jamming because it worked on a frequency the existing jammers did not. Cover. Roughly 100 Berlin sets reached operational status by the end of the war. The Allies had thousands of H2X and carpet sets in service by the same date. A post-war report from the Harvard Radio Research Laboratory stated that Allied electronic countermeasures had reduced German anti-aircraft efficiency by an estimated 75%, and that by the end of the war, almost 90% of Germany's high-frequency radio specialists, roughly 7,000 men, had been diverted to the single problem of defeating Allied jamming. They never solved it. Not because the physics was beyond them, but because the system they worked inside could not deliver solutions at the speed the war required. By February of 1944, the convergence of escort fighters, electronic countermeasures, and radar bombing through overcast produced the week that broke the Luftwaffe as an effective defensive force. Operation Argument, known as Big Week, ran from February 20th to February 25th. The 8th Air Force, the 15th Air Force flying from Italy, and Royal Air Force Bomber Command together launched roughly 3,800 sorties against the German aircraft industry. The 8th lost 137 heavy bombers. The 15th lost 89. Bomber Command lost 131. Those were serious numbers, but they were a far smaller percentage of the attacking forces than Schweinfurt had been, because the forces were now vastly larger. The P-51 Mustang escorts were killing German fighters before they reached the bomber stream, and the electronic countermeasures were degrading the flak that had once been the bomber's deadliest enemy. The Germans lost roughly a third of their single-engine fighters and an estimated 18% of their fighter pilots during Big Week. They could replace the aircraft. They could not replace the pilots. On the opening day of Big Week, February 20th, 1944, a pilot named First Lieutenant William Lawley, Jr., of the 305th Bomb Group, earned the Medal of Honor. His B-17 was hit by fighters over Leipzig. The co-pilot was killed. Lawley was wounded in the face and hands. Several crew members were severely injured. The aircraft was on fire. Lawley brought the burning bomber back across the channel, refused to bail out because wounded men in the rear could not jump, and crash-landed in England, saving the lives of his crew. He was 23 years old. He had been a student in Alabama before the war. Men like Lawley were flying through skies that Joan Curran and Frederick Terman and George Valley and Reginald Victor Jones and the paratrooper radar mechanic Charles Cox had made survivable. The gunners below were still firing, still dangerous, still killing men. Flak accounted for roughly two-thirds of the 700 bombers lost by the 8th Air Force in June, July and August of 1944, and 98% of the 13,000 bombers damaged in those same months. But the precision that had made flak a surgical instrument was gone. The guns were firing into a sky they could no longer read. After the war, among the documents the British and American intelligence services reviewed were the transcripts from Trent Park, the converted manor house in North London, where captured senior German officers had been held since 1942, in comfortable conditions, unaware that every room was wired for sound. The operation was run by MI-19, the British military intelligence section responsible for prisoner interrogation, under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Kendrick. Kendrick had been a spy before the war, running the British Secret Intelligence Service station in Vienna until the Gestapo arrested him in 1938. Now he ran Trent Park, and his weapon was not interrogation in any conventional sense. It was patience. The generals were given good food, exercise privileges, chess sets, books, and the run of the gardens. They were encouraged to talk to each other. What they did not know was that every room, including the bedrooms, the dining room, and the lavatories, was wired with hidden microphones. The men transcribing the conversations in the basement were the secret listeners, a unit of German-speaking intelligence officers, many of them Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who had fled the very regime whose generals they were now eavesdropping on. They worked in shifts, day and night, for years. The transcripts they produced run to tens of thousands of pages and were kept classified for decades. They were rediscovered in the British National Archives by historian Sonke Neitzel and published in a book that revealed for the first time what German generals actually said to each other when they believed no one could hear. In those conversations, the captured generals spoke with a candor they never permitted themselves in public. They discussed the V weapons, the Eastern Front, the failures of their own high command, and they discussed the air war with a bitterness that reveals how deeply the electronic defeat had shaken them. One general, captured in Tunisia, told a fellow prisoner that the British and Americans had achieved something the German Luftwaffe had never managed. They had turned science into a weapon as effectively as they had turned steel into one. Another officer, a signals specialist, said that Germany's failure was not in the quality of its engineers, but in the blindness of its leaders to what those engineers were telling them. He said Göring had been warned repeatedly that Allied jamming was coming and that countermeasures had to be developed before the blow fell, not after. He said Göring had ignored every warning. He said this with the exhausted bitterness of a man who had watched a preventable disaster happen in slow motion. They understood, in private, what had happened. They understood that their radar network had been systematically dismantled by an enemy whose scientific establishment was faster, more integrated, and better supported than their own. They understood that the bombers coming through the clouds by 1944 were operating in a dimension the German defences could no longer reach. What they kept circling back to in those bugged rooms was not the technology itself, it was the system behind the technology. They could see that the Allies had built something their own side had not, a way of connecting a scientist's laboratory bench to a squadron's bomb bay in months rather than years, a way of capturing an enemy's radar in a commando raid and having a working jammer built against it before the enemy had changed the frequency. The Germans had brilliant scientists working in isolation. The Allies had good scientists working together, and together was winning. Here is the part that deserves to be said plainly, because it would be dishonest not to say it. The Wurzburg was a masterpiece. The Kommandogerät was an engineering achievement that Allied analysts studied with genuine admiration after the war. The men who built the Kammhuber line created a defensive system that, in the absence of countermeasures, was devastatingly effective. The problem was never the engineers. The problem was that the system those engineers worked inside was incapable of protecting them, incapable of prioritizing their warnings, incapable of moving their solutions from the workbench to the battlefield at the speed the war demanded. The Allied system did all of those things, not because Allied scientists were smarter, but because Allied leaders, Churchill, and the American military establishment, and the directors of MIT and Harvard, built institutions that let scientists be scientists, and then listened to what they said. The German leaders built institutions that treated scientists as subordinates, whose opinions could be overruled by a former fighter pilot who did not understand what a wavelength was. And the men who paid for that institutional failure were not the leaders. They were the 18-year-old flak helpers, standing beside an 88mm gun in a field outside Bremen, firing shell after shell into a cloud they could not see through, at bombers they could not detect, hoping that random chance would put a shell close enough to matter. Those young men did not fail. They were failed. So here is the answer to the question the Himmelbett controller asked into his radio over Hamburg on the night of July 24, 1943. Where did the enemy go? Why can I not see them? The answer is that they were still there. They were flying through the same sky, at the same altitude, on the same course. But between the radar dish and the bomber, there were now 92 million strips of aluminum-backed paper, each one 27 centimeters long, each one reflecting the Wurzburg's own signal back at it, each one indistinguishable from an aircraft. And behind the chaff, there were carpet jammers broadcasting noise on the Wurzburg's frequency, drowning the real signal in static. And above the cloud layer, there were H-2X radar sets, looking down through the overcast at the city below, seeing what the gunners could not see, finding the target that the gunners could not find. The system that was supposed to protect the Reich was not defeated by a superior enemy in a fair fight between equals. It was defeated by a handful of laboratories staffed by physicists, radio engineers, and mathematicians who had been given two things the German scientists had been denied. They were given trust. And they were given each other. Joan Curran cut strips of paper in a laboratory in Malvern. Frederick Terman built jammers in a laboratory in Cambridge. George Valley designed a radar eye in a laboratory 4 miles from Terman's. Charles Cox, the flight sergeant, parachuted into France to steal the machine they needed to understand. Jones connected all of them to the war with intelligence that told them exactly what to attack and when. None of them could have succeeded alone. All of them together built an electronic shield that the German gun crews never penetrated. The Wurzburg dishes are gone now. The Kommandogerät predictors are museum pieces. The Kammhuber line exists only in the records of the signals intelligence officers who mapped it and the crews who flew through it. But the names deserve to be remembered. Joan Curran, who cut the foil, Frederick Terman, who built the noise, George Valley, who gave the bombers eyes in the dark, Jones, who told them where to look, Cox, who jumped into France to steal the secret, and William Lawley, 23 years old, bleeding from the face, holding a burning bomber level over the English Channel because the wounded men behind him could not jump. They were not all soldiers. Most of them never saw a battlefield. But they fought a war that was as real as any infantry engagement, a war measured in frequencies and wavelengths and decibels, and they won it so completely that the men on the other side, the men with the best radar and the biggest guns, ended the war firing blindly into clouds full of ghosts. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this analysis reach the viewers who care about the history that actually happened. Not the version where the bombers always got through because they were supposed to, and not the version where the flak never mattered because the textbooks say it did not. The real version. The version where a Welsh physicist and a Stanford radio engineer and a young flight sergeant and a 23-year-old pilot from Alabama were part of the same invisible chain that stretched from a laboratory bench in Malvern to a burning cockpit over Leipzig. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary people in ordinary jobs, who built things that changed the course of a war without ever being recognized for it. They had names. They came from somewhere. And they deserve to be remembered by the thing about them that the men on the other side of the radar screens never had a chance to understand.